And each day we're going to pick up on a new topic. And for today, we're going to be having a very interesting topic, a very thought provoking topic, in fact, engaging the faith community in land restoration. We did touch upon this topic a little bit earlier today, and I'd love to know a little bit further. And the idea is for all of you to take on a very unique approach or a unique perspective after this conversation. I really hope that happens as well, and I'm sure we will, because we have a very, very, very interesting and prolific esteemed speaker with us, Dr. Charles McNeil. For over 30 years, Dr. McNeil served as a leader in the United Nations to build innovative multi sector partnerships to solve global environmental challenges. And most recently, he founded and led the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, IRL, an international alliance convened by United Nations Environment Programme to bring faith-based leadership to local, national, and global efforts to end tropical deforestation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. McNeil. Thank you once again for joining us. And it was amazing listening to you speak this morning. And what really piqued my interest when I heard you speak is to understand from a personal experience what really inspired you to engage with faith-based communities, and from a very personal experience, what was your journey like in terms of engaging with them?
Thank you. Thank you for Hello, hello. Ah, Thank you for the question. Great to be here. And to be honest, I never, ever expected my career after some 30 years at the UN to take the turn that it did, to go from technical, scientific, political policymaking to working with faith-based organizations. Um, and it's been a fascinating and dramatic and fulfilling ride. And I'm so happy to see that Juan Carlos Diaz is here with us, indigenous leader from the Amazon, a very esteemed and powerful leader and shaman in his own right. And he had a lot to do with inspiring this journey. As I'm surprised to see him here, but I'm glad to see him here. What really inspired this was, first of all, the facts that tropical forests are being decimated. Tropical forests are, if they were a country, they would be producing, their loss produces as much emissions as the entire European Union. They produce more greenhouse gas emissions than all the cars, trucks, planes, trains, the whole transport sector, and it's completely avoidable. It's also true that if these forests were protected and restored, they could contribute up to a third of what's needed to achieve the Paris goals. And the loss of those forests, which are the home of Juan Carlos here, these that's where 2/3 of the world's biodiversity exists. So the extinction crisis that we're facing is also driven by the loss of these forests. And then the third element of the polycrisis. Our world is now facing a polycrisis. It's not a there aren't standalone issues. It's not one, two, or three. It's a crisis. It's a real cluster in many ways, and tropical forests hold the key to that. Now, so that really got me interested and inspired. But I want to say that being here in Riyadh, I have a new perspective because I'm now appreciating the land restoration agenda, the desertification, degradation, drought issue in a whole new way, because that issue, like tropical forests, also is a potential game changer. And just yesterday, Johan Rockstrom spoke. He did a special report for CCD that just came out yesterday, and I was just struck by what he said. For example, we've had a stable climate for 11,700 years. For 11,700 years, our climate did not vary more than half a degree centigrade. Now, in the last 150 years, we've gone up 1.3, headed towards 2. So it's just dramatic. In the last 12,000 years, we have destabilized our climate. And as a result, we've also degraded, we learned 15 million kilometers, 15 square million kilometers. That's the size of Antarctica, almost the size of Russia. Uh, we've turned our planet into a garbage pit. And that's a huge resource, a huge potential. The third point that I learned yesterday, and that I sort of knew, but it came back to me more clearly, is this degradation crisis is undermining the Earth's capacity to sustain humankind, and that the forest loss and the land degradation are driving the hunger, the migration, and the conflicts and the political strife. So you really see that all the headlines are being caused by this issue being dealt with here. So a long answer to a short question, but that's really what has inspired me now to pay attention to how we could apply the lessons that we've learned from a partnership between religious leaders and the international community to, to stop tropical deforestation, how those technologies, methodologies can be applied strongly to the land restoration agenda. And so that's really what has got my attention. And the last part of the answer I want to say is that the lack of progress, as I mentioned earlier, my UN career started at the Rio Earth Summit, where all three of these conventions came. At that time, we knew everything we needed to know to take action on climate, on biodiversity, and on land degradation, and we haven't. So 7 years ago, we realized whatever we're doing as the UN, government, science, NGOs, business, whatever we're doing, it is not working. And we thought we needed a new approach. We needed to actually inspire people from the heart. Now, the heart is not a term a UN official or a scientist would use on an everyday occurrence, but I use it intentionally today because we realized we needed to inspire, motivate people from the heart because nothing else has worked. And that's what brought us to reach out to work with religious leaders and indigenous leaders like Juan Carlos here. And that's been transformative as I can explain.
I think a lot of things that you said is a perfect segue into the next question that I would like to pose, which is, as you mentioned, I think it's understood. It is definitely something that we all know the kind of potential that faith leaders and faith communities have when it comes to the global land restoration agenda. But as you also mentioned, their approaches may be very different from the way policymakers and NGOs and governments may deal with the agenda. So, according to you, what are some of the unique contributions that faith communities have already made when it comes to the global land restoration agenda?
Yes, thank you. You know, one of the inspirations also was Pope Francis back in 2015 with his Laudato Si. At the same time, we saw Muslim leaders starting to take action, and it occurred to us, perhaps we can have some partnerships there. Um, we also noticed that in all the villages and towns of the developing world, often there's no UN presence, there's no government presence, there's no foreign aid, but there's always a temple or a church or a mosque. So it's the ever sort of the widespread presence of faith communities that were important in terms of making a difference in this area. We also, I think it's obvious that religious leaders have political power. They have influence. They can support progressive legislation. They can oppose regressive legislation. A third point, as we know, is the economic financial power of religious leaders. Um, and, and another, as we mentioned earlier today, are religious leaders and religious communities have enormous land holdings. It's something like 510 million hectares are under control of religions, and collaborating with these organizations offers a potential to really catalyze global progress on restoration. Another point, and I think we talked a little bit about this, is that faith communities um, uh, are have the potential to um, partner and support Indigenous peoples. I think we know that where Indigenous peoples have land rights, where they're empowered, that's where conservation happens. That's where low greenhouse gas emissions. That's where water is protected. That's where biodiversity is protected. And so that relationship has been dramatic and important in the work that we've done. I think last point would be I think that already, as I look into this, faith-based organizations are active in land restoration one by one in various parts of the world. I think what's possible is to really scale that up. And there are lessons that we can derive from our own work that can help inform how to scale that up.
So at G20 Global Land Initiative, we work with various stakeholders. We work a lot with ecopreneurs. We work a lot with policymakers. So you also mentioned about the power of collaboration right now and scaling these efforts to make sure that all these entities comes together. So in your opinion, how can we really scale that up? Like, what are some of the approaches that we can take together as an organization, as an entity? What are the different ways that we can do it?
Well, great, because I would like to reflect on our experience over the last 7 years, and I come back to that first point that I've talked about a few times, and that is that over the past 500 years, Indigenous peoples have been oppressed, suppressed, um, uh, degraded, and really disempowered, and a lot of that has been uh, generated by sort of Western society and the traditional religions in a way. What what I've been seeing in our work, and Juan Carlos can can reject or accept, but my observation has been that the religious leaders have opened up their hearts to recognize um, not only the spirituality of the indigenous leaders, but the historic and courageous role that they've played to protect our natural world. And that recognition, that explicit recognition, often accompanied by an apology for the terrible history that we've had, has opened up a potential for collaboration. I think I've seen Juan Carlos at the Vatican meeting with Pope Francis, and he's met with various leaders all over the place. And so that historical healing holds enormous potential, not only for the tropical forest agenda, but I argue as well throughout the rest of the world. And that's something that I think Juan Carlos and others can help in those other countries which are, uh, being hurt by land degradation. I think Juan Carlos can really help advise on how to make that work. The other lessons we've learned, one is that, and I mentioned this a little earlier, that religions can work one by one on issues or they can work collectively. And our approach has been collective. The Muslims, the Catholics, the Protestants, the Hindus, the Confucius, the Jews, all the various faiths have come together. And that's been powerful because when they speak with one voice, governments listen. So that's one thing. The other is um, it's useful to have a convening force. In this case, it was the United Nations. I went to these countries, I met with the leaders, having a convening body, a neutral body that could allow all the religious leaders to come together and work on this issue, which I found they all agree on. It seems to be one of the few issues they all agree on. But so you need some kind of a convening force. You need some funds. In this case, the government of Norway was generous in putting up the funds to make this happen. We also need some kind of a small secretariat to facilitate the work. It's useful to know that each country is different. There isn't kind of a cookie cutter approach. You have to be sensitive to the social, economic, political realities of the countries. Um, and I think we found that the biggest impact for change was at the local, uh, uh, regional, and national level. That there's probably something that can be done at the global level, but really working in the villages, working in the communities is where I think we can make the greatest impact. And I think those are some of the lessons I'd say we'd learn, and resources are needed to scale up these initiatives.
Absolutely. I think it's very fascinating the kind of work that you're doing at Interfaith Rainforest Initiative. But having worked with different sectors, were there challenges when it comes to bridging spiritual values with scientific and policy driven approaches? And if so, what are the kind of challenges that you have faced in your 7 years of experience?
You know, I really didn't see too much of a break between the spiritual values and the sort of technical people. What was important was that the technical people respected this religious people and vice versa. That this initiative is not about turning um, a religious leader into a technical expert. What really worked was when the technical experts and the indigenous leaders could basically brief the religious leaders to say, what are the gaps? Where are the challenges? Where are the breakdowns? Where are the urgent needs? And then the religious leaders could see where they could make a difference. So that was, as long as those rules were clear, that the technical people were there to lay out the issues. And then it was the indigenous peoples and the religious leaders who made the decisions and drove the agenda. So as long as we are clear about that, I didn't see any tension along the lines that you were pointing to.
I think everyone who's listened on this conversation is also aware of your storytelling abilities and how important you think storytelling is when it comes to mobilizing communities. I'd love to, and I'm sure everyone here would also love to hear success stories when it comes to illustrating the kind of impact faith leaders have had in advancing restoration efforts around the world.
Great. Yes, um, Colombia is one country that comes to mind when you ask that question. And in Colombia, the local interfaith rainforest initiative team trained more than 14,000 religious leaders. So actually had some rigorous training on the science of climate and forests and on the indigenous status and rights. And then millions of people were reached by campaigns on the TV, radio, and social media. But one thing that I found particularly strategic about what's happening in Colombia is that the team there first lobbied Congress to get major articles about halting deforestation built into the national development plan that was under construction. So with that foundation, they then mapped out the country to find out where are the hotbeds, where is the highest rates of deforestation, and where are the places where indigenous rights are being violated most seriously. And that's where they went to work establishing local interfaith rainforest initiative. That is, getting all the faiths together with the indigenous leaders in the local communities. And there they had a very interesting strategy. They pounced on the local municipal and statewide elections. So whenever a mayor or a governor election came up, they organized roundtables and they had all the candidates come up to a situation like this, and they actually asked their position on indigenous people's rights, on tropical deforestation, and they got them to commit to sign a statement that if elected, they would take steps to protect the rainforest and indigenous people's rights. And then, no matter who got elected, they went back to those elected people and say, okay, we're here now to collect on your commitment. And they managed to get these interfaith rainforest initiative people appointed to local and statewide planning councils, which is allowing them year after year to actually monitor the forest and land use planning decisions and commitments that are made. So this is happening now in 42 local chapters. So it's a dramatic example of political mobilization and influence by religious leaders in partnership with indigenous leaders. So that's one example that is I find particularly inspiring.
That's very fascinating because I think there may be many drivers, right, when it comes to land degradation, which might not be getting as much attention when it from policymakers or from parliamentarians or from legislators. Have you seen of instances where um, religious leaders and faith communities have helped address these drivers in an efficient manner, uh, which is interesting because you also spoke about how they acted as political leaders in the past in the story that you mentioned.
Yes. Yes, earlier today I talked about a couple of examples. I don't want to repeat here because I know some of you were there. Um, I think another example um, that happened in Brazil is they've created a three-dimensional virtual reality experience of the Amazon. And it happens to be true that in Brazil, very few people have any experience of the Amazon. It's an unknown. And so they've created this. It's turned out to be a dazzling, award winning 3D experience of the Amazon led by an indigenous woman leader. And they've now shown this to hundreds of thousands of people through the country, including political leaders and religious leaders. And actually, because they couldn't bring these people to the Amazon, they brought the Amazon to these people. And it's now in major museums in Brazil. It was featured at the Rio Rock in Rio, the biggest rock festival in the world, just a week or two ago. It was featured in Paris during the Olympics and so on. So this virtual reality experience has been a way to really sensitize people in Brazil to the issues in the Amazon, and it has led to some really powerful results. So that's just another kind of example that I wanted to point to.
That's very interesting, and I actually have never heard of this virtual reality experience. So it also gives all of us incentive to go back and read up more about it. And on that note, as I mentioned earlier, that this session is more about opening up and having a chat with the audience as well. So if you have any questions for Dr. McNeil, I would urge all of you to ask those questions, and we can keep the chatter going for another 10 minutes. So the floor is yours.
Oh, I'd love to hear from Juan Carlos. He's such a rock star himself.
Absolutely.
My goodness, he's all
Absolutely.
over the world. Um, but I don't want to force him to.
Thank you very much. My name is Juan Carlos. I'm coming from the rainforest of Ecuador country. Very nice to hear my friend Charles McNeil. One of my questions that's coming in my mind is, what is your advice? Many indigenous people, we are following the CBD. I mean, recently in the COP16, and then many other indigenous leaders are also following the UNFCCC dialogues, climate change, and the results. And then we are here to try to understand, and that's one of my questions. And hearing you, I think so that we need to connect that experience, that voices, that millions of indigenous people from the ground, the international arena. But at the end of the day, we're still feeling that we need to keep moving, keep talking, doing the lobbying. What will be your advice? Because we need to connect that
Yes.
experience in a good moving, not separate arenas and different platforms.
Wow. Thank you, Juan Carlos. I really appreciate that. You know, your inquiry is the same inquiry I think we're all having. There's this recognition. It's very late coming that these three issues, climate, biodiversity, land degradation, they're all interrelated, and that it's important to be working on them in a coherent, coordinated way in order to avoid damage. If you work on one and not the other, you could have a biofuel energy scheme that overlaps and undermines indigenous people's rights, that undermines food security, that undermines biodiversity, while partially solving a climate issue. Hydropower, another example that you could have that be a solution for the climate issue, but it might be devastating to indigenous peoples and biodiversity. So you have to be thinking of them in a collective way. And I mentioned that my first assignment with the UN was the Rio Earth Summit. I was supporting that at the time, and even then, there was talk of coordinating, aligning the three conventions. But somehow, over these 30 years, we haven't. They've gone in their own separate tracks. But I feel a very strong intention, like you've expressed, that we have to bring these these various efforts together. And also for you, it's very time consuming and costly to have to track three different conventions. Um, and so my advice would be, I think you need to be represented here. I've noticed that you and your peoples have had a much stronger impact in the Biodiversity Convention from day one, it seems. The convention embodied your concern, gave you voice, gave you formal standing before the climate convention. That's coming along. And now I think this convention is starting to wake up to and recognize the importance of your rights. So the bad news is I think you need to be here and you need to be advocating and you need to educate this constituency, these decision makers, and wake them up to your concerns while uh, while we try to bring together, coordinate action on these three. It's the same governments that are represented in all three conventions, oftentimes different people making different decisions. So it's a job in every government to coordinate, to coalesce, to make coherent their approaches. But I do feel that that consciousness is taking, and then Gopal Patel here has been leading an effort, a very powerful effort, to bring these three conventions together from the perspective of faith leaders, to educate faith leaders on all three conventions, not just one or the other. And that initiative, I think, has got huge potential. And that's what's inspired me to be an advocate here for religious leaders to take on the land degradation issue like they've taken on climate and taken on tropical forests. So we're all facing the same challenge. I'm so glad you raised the question, but I do urge you, you're such a powerful communicator and advocator. We need you here to get this convention on your agenda as well. But I really want to thank Gopal and Tariq for their efforts to bring the faith leaders together in this space.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. You know, I have just a comment. Just a comment. As an indigenous people, I come from Sahara and Sahel. I come from Niger. I come from dry lands, the reverse of my colleague from Amazonia. So it is the first time I hear testimony from bureaucrats. I like your introduction, you know. You come from bureaucracy and you come and meet communities on the field. It's very, very nice. I want to encourage you and I want to help us lobby this convention to 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 open to open places for indigenous. Indigenous have so much things to say to the world. We are we are the Mother Earth children. We keep the earth.
Yes.
So let's come and then we will teach you how
Yes.
to take care of our Mother Earth. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And I agree 100%. And the last 20 or 30 years of my career has been about working with Carlos and his colleagues and to try to forge that collaboration. And yes, I'm a bureaucrat, but yes, I have a heart too.
Thank you, Charles, for those nice words and kind words. Over dinner last night and today in the morning session, you alluded to one thing I love about working with you is that you kind of look or work 2 or 3 steps ahead of everybody else, and your career in the UN is illustrative of that. And one thing you're talking about increasingly is the issue that can align the 3 conventions is agriculture and food systems. So I'm wondering if you could just share a little bit more about that, because it really does seem like that's the thing that can really bring us all together.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so glad. I appreciate your raising that question because I had forgotten I wanted to raise that. And as I've worked on tropical forests and these other environmental issues, I was a slow learner to realize that sucking sound that's destroying Carlos's forests, that's degrading the land, that's causing the 6th great extinction. The last great extinction was a huge meteor that hit the earth. Now the 6th extinction is caused by us, humankind, as a meteor. And so this food system, and I've been now paying attention to this food system, it's deeply broken. It's a food system that causes a third of all the greenhouse gases. It's causing at least 80% of all the biodiversity loss and extinction. It's in the Amazon, it's driving 90% of the deforestation. Beef by itself, beef and the soy to feed the beef is causing 90% of the deforestation in Brazil, for example. It's also causing it's using up 70% of water, and it's causing 2 billion people to suffer from being overweight and obese, and 100 million people are hungry. So it is a broken system, and we have to take account of that. And one of the observations that surprises me is that if you look at the whole Earth, half of all the habitable Earth is devoted to agriculture now. Half of all the habitable Earth, and of that, 80% is for animal agriculture. 80%. And yet, that only gives us 17% of the calories and only 30%, 37% of protein. So the meat production, the meat and dairy is a very, very inefficient way to feed people. And in the North, our addiction to meat and dairy is killing us. It's causing tremendous health issues and environmental issues. So this idea of reducing our animal protein consumption to improve our own health, the planet health, is something that has really caught my attention and is needed, along with reducing the 30% of or 40% of all our food is wasted or lost. So the shifting diets, reducing food waste, and then making our food production more sustainable. And then the fourth one is securing land rights for indigenous peoples, local communities, and farmers. Those four interventions are things that are needed to really address this poly crisis that I talked about at the beginning. And these are four areas that I think faith leaders, religious leaders, and faith communities can help with. I want to urge Pope Francis to have a meat-free Friday, and the various other religious leaders can help with all four of those interventions. So that's my new campaign is I really want us all to take that on, because that will help deal with this crisis that we're dealing with here in this convention and all the other crises.
Thank you so much. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today's conversation. But I urge all of you to take this conversation forward. Dr. Charles is here. Tariq is also here to engage with you in the work that we are doing at G20 Global Land Initiative with faith leaders. And in the coming days, I hope all of you come back. We're going to be having much more interesting conversations, chats, and all of the speakers that we have had today is going to be here at the pavilion as well. You can also scan the QR code over there to get a full view of all the events that we have planned for you. Thank you so much once again for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Charles, for the very insightful conversation. I've learned so much from this conversation. So thank you and have a wonderful evening.